recall, if you're members or not, if you did not get an email from me, I sent an email early this week to members only. If you did not get that email about voting for directors, you're not a member, but that's okay. You're all on your honor. I'm really glad to see you all. What we're doing tonight is we're going to vote for a board of directors, which we don't have officially. When we were incorporated 30 some odd years ago, it called for us to have a board of directors. There was an original board of directors, and then I'm not sure what happened. 3 years ago, when Arnie Beeman, who had been president, retired, resigned, and moved to Maine, Doug took over with my assistance. And we were doing what had been done, what Bob did, Bob Breer was doing, etc., for a year or so. Then we got together, a group of people, asked for volunteers to help for programs. And so we've been meeting with a committee, and that included Bob Arnold, Bob Barnes, Charlie Blanchard, Wally, Kitty Lowenthal, Rich, and you've seen them, some of them have done programs here. And so now it's time for us to do what we were supposed to do originally under the Articles of Incorporation and have a board of directors. So and I really want to thank people who have stepped up and said they would help. If anybody has a problem with any of this, fine, but you figure it out, okay? So it's on you. It's on you. So again, if people want to just stand up, so those of you who are here, Bob Arnold, Susan Arnold, if you guys would just stand, Bob Barnes, Charlie Blanchard, Mike Caplette, Bob Giafone, Wally Hersey, Bob Lauritsen, Kitty Lowenthal, Rich, and Rich Paradise, and Doug. These are people who are willing to work with us, to be our board of directors, to give us direction, okay? So it's not just me and Doug doing our thing. So I appreciate this, and really, I didn't ask for all the Bobs. I don't know, somehow it just seems like technical. So anyways, what I'm going to ask for now, I ask for a motion to approve this slate, and then I will ask all the members, and again, on your honor, to just say aye or nay, and that will be it. So I appreciate that. So can I have a motion to approve this slate of proposed directors? Jeff?
I make a motion that we vote for the board of directors.
Okay, thank you. Jeff Earls. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Wally. All right. All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you very much. Thank you to all the board of directors. And now we'll close the meeting. The meeting part is adjourned. Upcoming meetings, before I introduce Doug. On Thursday, April 22nd, May 22nd, big day coming up. In the morning, on Thursday, May 22nd, Bob Breer will be doing his geraniums at the Oak Burial Ground, 10 a.m. It's a nice program. He's done this for a number of years. Students from Burgess come, and the Publick House provides geraniums, and they're placed on the graves of the Revolutionary soldiers, or any soldiers who are buried there. Open to the public. We hope to see you there. That evening is our Historical Society program. Wally Hersey is going to be doing the program talking about the 1938 bicentennial celebration where Sturbridge celebrated the bicentennial of its founding, and he's got a film that was taken at the time that has been restored. He's going to be talking about that celebration, which was a big affair at the time. I mean, this long pageants were the things at the time. They had this big pageant all day and a parade and everything else. So he's going to be talking about the bicentennial of the town of Sturbridge. Tonight, we have Doug Quigley, who is going to be talking about the Revolution, the early part of the Revolution, American Revolution. As you know, we're now celebrating the 250th anniversary, America 250 of our founding. Doug has lived in Sturbridge since 1979. He came here to work at Old Sturbridge Village. He has been a lifelong lover of history. This comes naturally. I think you got to blame Walt Disney for that. Davy Crockett, right? That was a big influence on him, and he was also always in the fife and drum corps as well. He's always been interested in it. He's done reenacting, since he was a teenager. Rev War, Civil War. He also does the Village period, etc. Combines that with his musicianship. He's a fifer. He was 3 years in the Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. So those two things he's always combined. Worked at the Village as an interpreter for a while. He continues to volunteer at the Village, as well as continuing to do various reenacting, which changes as they get older. They used to be Civil War soldiers. Now they're the veterans. They portray the GAR veterans. But he does that both as a reenactor. He might march, he might do a camp, or he'll play music. Okay, either way. And so you'll see him out and about. He also has helped establish the Sturbridge Militia Company, which shows up for Memorial Day. They'll be there probably when they do the geraniums on Memorial Day here. And they did the Lafayette program, etc. So he's got a long history with that. So he knows what he's talking about, I think. I'm biased, but what do you know? So anyways, please welcome Doug tonight, who will talk to you about the Revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a hard act to follow. But we're going to talk about the American Revolution tonight. It is the 250th. Last Saturday was the exact 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord. So I thought, way back last winter, it would be a good program tonight. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's like History 101, but it's kind of fun, and I got a couple of connections with Sturbridge, which should be interesting. I'm going to be throwing a lot of dates out, years out. Don't worry about it. Don't get confused, but it kind of helps understanding the sequence of things, because a lot of things happened over 10, 15 years that all culminated with the Revolutionary War. So bear with me on that. What?
Will this be on the test?
Yeah. There'll be a quiz at the end. Okay. In 1763, the French and Indian War ended. That was a huge conflict fought mostly in North America between England and France. England won. France was defeated. They gave up Canada. That's why Canada is part of England today, because of the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. The Americans were thrilled, the colonists. They were, loyal subjects of the king. They were glad they won. Many had served in the French and Indian War, including George Washington. He was an officer with the British Army at the time. The unfortunate thing for England, it cost a lot of money. It was very expensive to bring an army across the ocean and fight all those years in Europe and also in the United States. So they had to come up with a way of paying for it, and since it benefited the colonists, they thought the colonists would not mind at all to pay for it. Little did they know. So they began in 1764. They passed the tax on sugar and molasses, and that doesn't seem too serious, but sugar and molasses were part of the process of making rum, and rum was a big business on the East Coast, the West Indies, so that affected a lot of people. In 1765, they passed the Stamp Act. And that was, I always thought as a kid, stamp, you buy a stamp and you send letters, but the Stamp Act was actually I think it was like notarizing papers or any documents. So they had to pay a tax on any papers. That included wills, marriage licenses, pamphlets, and even playing cards, decks of playing cards. So now you've got not just the lawyers and the rich people, but the common folk all paying taxes. And they weren't happy about that. There was a lot of unrest. They attacked stamp collectors. They burned some of the custom houses where the monies were collected. And a message got back to Europe, and the king finally repealed those two taxes. Again, they still had this big bill to deal with, so in 1767, they passed the Townshend Act. And that was another tax, but that was on tax on glass, paper, lead, and tea. And again, that does sound not too dangerous, but glass was used in all houses, windows. Again, we know what paper was used for. Lead was used not just for bullets, but for paint. So this tax affected a lot of people too. Again, more unrest, more protests. They attacked the houses of these stamp collectors, tax collectors. And it got really, even ransacked the governor's house to let them know they weren't pleased with it. England responded in 1768 by sending 2,000 additional troops, British Army troops, to Boston to help settle the colonists down. So it did not go well. You have, 2,000 added to, I don't know, it was 3,000 or 4,000 troops already in Boston. You got this population at unrest, being not very happy with the king. And it came to a culmination in March 5th of 1770. There was a single British soldier on duty in downtown Boston in front of the Custom House. And in the evening, he was being harassed. There was a crowd starting to gather. They threw stones at him. They threw snowballs. They threw sticks at him. The crowd got bigger. The lone soldier called for help. So relief came, about 12, 15 more troops. Meanwhile, people began to ring bells to draw people out onto in front of the Custom House. And when the tradition of ringing bells usually meant there was a fire, so people began to yell, "Fire!" There's a commotion, crowd, and all of a sudden, the British soldiers opened fire. They fired into the crowd, killing 5 individuals. This is a engraving that was published at the time. Paul Revere was responsible for this engraving. And it's really a piece of propaganda when you think about it, because it shows the British lined up, organized, the officer with his sword, giving the command to fire, and these poor individuals just receiving the fire and falling down. That's not exactly how it happened. I mean, it was terrible, and it was a loss of life. But eventually, those soldiers stood trial for murder. They were defended by a lawyer in Boston named John Adams, and he got them all acquitted. None of them were found guilty of that case. But it became a big piece of propaganda, and it only stirred more hatred toward these British forces that were occupying the city. So these taxes were all repealed as a result of that commotion, except in 1773, again, they still tried to raise money, so they kept one tax on tea. At this time, 1773, there was a company, the British East India Company, that was friendly with the king. They were in financial trouble, and they came up with a solution. They had 3 ships loaded with tea that they didn't know what to do with. They thought, we'll bring it to Boston, unload them, sell them at low prices, put a minimum tax on it, and everybody's happy. People get their tea, the ship owners sell their tea, and we collect the tax. Seemed pretty simple, except the Americans didn't like that. So when the ships landed, they have a 20-day grace period in which to unload the tea or leave. If they do neither, if they're confiscated, the tea is forcibly unloaded, and then it is sold. So on December 16th, the last day of this grace period, there was a huge meeting in the South Meeting House in Boston. They said there was over 3,000 people attending it, and if you ever been to the South Meeting House, it's not very big. But it was filled with 3,000 people. Sam Adams was the moderator. And what they did was they got the ship captain and they made him go down to visit the governor to get permission to leave Boston. They didn't want that tea unloaded. So the ship captain went to the governor's mansion. I think it was in Milton. It took a couple hours. And we returned early in the evening and said the governor refused to let him leave. I have to unload the ships tomorrow. Well, that's all they needed to hear. On a given cue, the South Meeting House emptied out. There was a group of about 60 individuals who were picked ahead of time. They wore disguises. They dressed like Indians, if you can imagine disguises. But they went down to the wharf. They very carefully and safely boarded the ships and threw all the tea overboard. 342 cases of tea were thrown into Boston Harbor. The crowd followed them down, watched the whole event, and everybody went home. One member of that tea party was a young man. He was born in Weston, and at the time he was learning the canning trade. He was a journeyman canner in Roxbury, and he participated in the Boston Tea Party. At the end of the war, he moved out to Sturbridge. He built a house about 300 yards from here at the corner of Hall Road and Route 131, abuts the brook there. And he operated a tannery there. His name was Samuel Hobbs. That's called Hobbs Brook for the family. If you look in the front yard down by the creek, there are some depressions, and those were the pits where they used to clean the hides, process the hides. He died 1823, and he's buried about 100 yards right over here in the old burial ground. That's his grave. And in 2023, marking the 250th anniversary of the Tea Party, they had a special committee come out from Boston, and they placed this marker identifying Samuel Hobbs as a participant in the Tea Party. So that marker is right over, again, right walking the cemetery, you look to your left, that's his grave, and that's his marker indicating he was a participant in the Tea Party. Well, England wasn't too happy about that, obviously. So in 1774, they passed the Coercive Acts. And this included, number one, the Boston Port Bill, which closed the entire port of Boston until the tea was paid for. So no ships could come in or leave until the tea was paid for. Number two was a Massachusetts Government Act. This meant there would be no town meetings, no official gatherings. The governor would appoint all officials. Anybody holding office or carrying on a business would be appointed by the governor. Number three was the Admissions of Justice Act. And that meant that any crown official, any tax collector, any of these agents, if they were accused of a crime, they'd be tried in England. They would not be tried in the United States here. And the fourth one was the Quartering Act, which essentially said, if you live in Boston and soldiers need a place to stay, they're coming to live with you. You have to open your house to the soldiers. So these were not well received by the people in Boston. And it's interesting, so this was in 1774. Also, in September 1st of 1774, the colonists had gotten together because there was also protests along the East Coast, Charleston, South Carolina, New York. They were all paying these taxes. So they had the First Continental Congress was held in Philadelphia. They had representatives from almost all of the colonies. They wrote a petition to the king expressing their displeasure of all these taxes. And they agreed again to meet in May of 1775. Also happening, so September was a busy month in 1774. There was a protest in Worcester. There was a minister from one of the surrounding towns had his son in Worcester, and his son went around and took records and recorded how many people were there from what town. And there was a total of 4,622 militiamen showed up in Worcester, including 150 men from Sturbridge. They blocked all the courts from opening. They dragged out the British authority, the officials. They formed lines of militia down the main street, and you can imagine how long that line was, 4,000. And these British agents had to walk down apologizing, repenting with their hats in their hand, repeating it all the way down as they left the city. They left the city, the courts never opened, and the British authorities never came back to Worcester. So that was a pretty successful event. All right, so what was Sturbridge doing at this time? They had a meeting in June of 1774. And I'll just read a little bit of it. I know it's hard to read. To consider some form of measure. So I'll read from that. You can come up. I'll have copies of these you can look at later on. But What it says is, and this was written in a town meeting, this sheet is in a book that's in the town hall, in the safe. It's all the minutes from the meetings held throughout all the 1700s. But it says, to consider of some measure proper to be adopted for the lofty defense of the providence in this dignified condition by reason of several late acts of the British Parliament. After solemn prayer to God for direction, after considerable debate on adopting some measure for the safety and defense of the providence, it appeared to be the mind of the town universally not to purchase any goods which shall be imported from Great Britain after the time stipulated. So, two things. One, they essentially were boycotting England. The town of Sturbridge voted publicly in a town meeting and recorded in their minutes that they were going to boycott England. And that phrase, the mind of the town, it shows up over and over again back then. Instead of saying the majority agreed or it was passed by the vast majority, they used this term, the mind of the town. It was kind of like, this is what everybody was thinking and they agreed upon. And it's written out, the mind of the town. You'll see that over and over again. And it's just it's a neat phrase, I think. Again, another page from the records. We're talking about Article 3. Let's see, Article 3. Right there. On the first day, I think that's the one. Anyway, September 28, 1774. Again, this is in the town records. On the Articles 3, it was put to vote to know the mind of the town, whether the town would make an additional to their stock of ammunition, passed in the affirmative to make an addition. Then the town voted to provide 4 half barrels of powder, 500 weight of lead, and 500 flints. One of the residents, Timothy Newell, offered half a barrel of powder himself if the town would accept it, and they did. So, in 1774, the town was starting to stockpile gunpowder. Those barrels of powder was gunpowder. Lead, I assume, could be melted down to make into bullets, and then flints. As later on, they come up and look, we have some muskets of that period of reproductions, although it wasn't original. But they're flintlocks, so you needed a piece of flint to make that gun go off. And to have a supply of flints was crucial to make the Minutemen effective and make their guns go off. So the town was willing to buy 500 flints. So this is just a picture of one of the recreations we did right across the street. When you refer to the training field, the Sturbridge training field, it's the town common. It was established in 1738. Set aside for use for training the militia. So this was an event we had a few years ago, but this shows what the citizens looked like. They wore no uniform, just their civilian clothes. They're carrying muskets and they were learning the drill. They learned how to march. This was part of what they had to do. So we got one more. Bear with me. So who were these Minutemen? There was an English muster law of 1572, going back that far to England, where they required male members of the community to gather once or twice a year by law, be recruited or supplied with a musket, things the necessary so that you could help out in the case of a defense of the community. That concept was brought over here, so every town in Sturbridge, in Massachusetts, as well as most of the colonies, had a requirement to be in a militia. It was a community duty, so to speak. It began to be taken serious. This appeared in the Essex Gazette of Salem, Massachusetts in March of 1775. So this is what appeared in the paper. It said, every person liable by law to train and to muster upon an alarm belonging to the militia of this town have been warned to appear on School Street at 9 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday next with arms and ammunition and accoutrements. It is hoped that every friend to his country, every man who has respect for the recommendation of the Provincial Congress or regards the safety of his life, liberty, and property will prepare himself to defend them against every invader, and appear thus prepared on School Street at the time above mentioned. The proper arms of the foot soldier are a well-fixed firelock and bayonet, a pouch that will hold 20 or 30 rounds of cartridges, half dozen flints, there's those flints again, 30 rounds of cartridges with ball, or a pound of powder and 30 balls, a knapsack, screwdriver, and priming wire. So again, this is the list of what these guys were obliged to turn out for their drills. Yeah, one more short one. This is from Brookfield, Massachusetts, in January of 1775. By the 1770s, towns were establishing, say you had 3 companies of militia that were turning out by law. They established a special company of Minutemen. This is the first time you start hearing the term Minutemen. They were a separate group from the regular militia, and they were, well, I'll read what it says right here. This is for the town of Brookfield. We, the subscribers, soldiers, enlisted from several militia companies within the town and organized into a company called the Minute Company, do solemnly covenant that we will, as soon as possible, be provided and equipped with effective firearm, cartouche box, 30 rounds of powder and bullets, and a knapsack, that we will exert our best abilities to acquire the art military, that we will yield a ready obedience to the commands of our officers and hold ourselves in readiness to march upon the earliest notice from our commanding officers and hazard our lives in resisting any armed force shall attempt by force to put in execution the late revenue acts, should any attempt be made between this time and the 1st of July next. So this is Brookfield. The other one was up in Salem, Massachusetts. So towns all over Massachusetts were responding to all this pressure and resistance from the massacre to the Tea Party, and they were beginning to arm themselves. They were storing gunpowder and flints to be ready. One last account. This is a quote. It says, "I have spent many an evening going through the exercise on the barn floor with my mittens on," wrote one Framingham Minuteman. So again, all over the state, they're preparing and drilling. This document is neat. This is also from Sturbridge. We have a copy up in the town clerk. This is from a company record book. So each company, when they met, they had a company clerk, and he'd record who was there and who was unprepared. So again, at the top, you can see those delinquent in arms or ammunition. So these are people who showed up, and they're going to list what they didn't have. And remember too, at this time, 1770s, Sturbridge included Southbridge. Southbridge wasn't incorporated until 1860. So when you talk about the town of Sturbridge, it's a large area. It includes all of Southbridge as well. So Jonathan Fawcett, right at the top, he's missing a hatchet and a knapsack. A knapsack, I have a reproduction up here, just like a tube sock worn over the shoulder. It's like a knapsack. Next guy, Ebenezer Knapp, was missing a hatchet, knapsack, and powder and wire. I love the next one. Jonathan, I don't know what it's, I can't read it, but it's scratched out. He showed up with nothing but a gun. So he didn't have a knapsack, didn't have gunpowder, didn't have a cartridge box, hatchet, but he had his gun. And I look down here. Whoops, I hit the wrong one. Is that the one? No. Around. Yeah, 27. Okay. Yeah, at the bottom, I believe it's here. It says that they appeared at the training field in Sturbridge. This is in 1746. Appeared at the training field in Sturbridge the 5th day of May at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with arms and ammunition according to the law. So again, all these militia companies are simply following the law, meeting their obligation. But by the 1770s and 75, it was getting a little bit more serious. Let's see. There we go. Again, another picture of militia across the street. You can see they have their accoutrements on. There's a powder horn for loose powder. These leather boxes or cartridge boxes, they would have pre-measured powder and cartridges. That gentleman is wearing a backpack, a variation of a backpack, water canteen. There's a bayonet over here. So all those things that were listed they had to require to carry, they wore them on their persons. This is how they were carrying. Another picture again across the street on the training field. This is one of our militia events we had. It was kind of fun drilling on the exact spot where we knew they drilled over the Sturbridge history. All right, we're going to go up to Boston in 1775. Doesn't look anything like this today. All this is filled. I think Logan Airport is over here. This is all filled in. I think that's all filled in. But in 1775, Boston was a little peninsula right here, connected to the mainland by this little neck. It was called the Boston Neck. There's Charlestown on the other side. This is the Charles River and the Mystic River. So Boston was like a peninsula with a little connection. Again, the British knew that the Americans were storing arms and ammunition in all the towns. They had confirmed that Concord, Massachusetts was particularly a stockpiling of gunpowder and flints. And they also heard that John Hancock and Sam Adams, some of the instigators among the Sons of Liberty, were meeting in Lexington. So they decided to make an expedition to go out and see if they can capture John Hancock and Sam Adams, and also get to Concord and destroy or bring back all these supplies. They had done it a couple months earlier up to Salem, Massachusetts. Word got out, they went in the daytime, they were met by the militia up there, and they just had a big argument back and forth over a bridge, and they turned around and went home. So nothing happened, no shots were fired. So they thought that was the policy of the British. But this time, just to make sure, they decided to keep it a secret. They were going to go at night, so nobody would know. They get out to Concord, get all this stuff, and return unknown. The problem was, everybody in Boston knew they were leaving, and they knew how they were going. They had two options to leave Boston. Concord and Lexington are up in this area here. They could take the road, across the land, and go all the way around up that way. It's a little bit longer. They'd be more exposed. People would see them. It wouldn't be as secretive. The other option was to load into boats, cross the Charles River, and go straight out to Lexington and Concord. The word got out. Joseph Warren, who was a patriot, Son of Liberty in Boston, he's the one that contacted Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a regular messenger. He had written many times before. So Joseph Warren contacted Paul Revere and William Dawes. Nobody's ever heard of William Dawes, because William Dawes didn't have a poem written about him. But he did the same thing Paul Revere did. Anyway, they were gathered, and they were going to go 2 different routes. Whoops, I keep pushing the wrong buttons. Oops, forgive me. There we go. William Dawes was going to take a horse ride off the Boston Neck, go that way, and go out to Lexington, Concord. Paul Revere is going to be rowed across the Charles River, pick up a horse, and ride, and hopefully catch up to Dawes and meet in Lexington and continue to Concord. Just in case neither of them made it, they prearranged a signal in the Old North Church for the people in Charlestown to see. And if you read that poem, was it 1 if by land, 2 if by sea? So we knew the 2 options. How many lanterns were hung? 2. But the British eventually, they went by boat. They rowed across and pretty much went the way Paul Revere did. It went bad from the start. They didn't have enough boats. They had to make 2-3 trips. The tide lowered down. Everybody was wet before they even left. Dawes and Paul Revere made it to Lexington. They warned Hancock and Adams. They picked up a 3rd rider, a doctor from Concord named Samuel Prescott. So the 3 of them, he had a girlfriend in Concord, in Lexington, by the way, so he was just leaving his date. So the 3 of them head off to warn Concord. Just outside of Lexington, they got stopped by a group of riders. They ended up being British officers who were patrolling the roads just for that purpose, to intercept any warnings or messengers. They split up and took off. William Dawes lost his horse, but he got away. Paul Revere was captured, not even a mile out of Lexington. Samuel Prescott, knowing the area, knowing the roads, he made it all the way to Concord and continued to spread the word. Meanwhile, the British They arrived in Lexington. There was 700 in their units. There was 77 Minutemen militia met them on the common. They weren't going to fight them. It was obviously overwhelming odds. Nobody knows what happened. They were told to disperse. They were told to lay down their arms by the British soldiers. A shot was fired. Nobody knows who did it. To this day, nobody knows who fired that first shot. The British opened up and they killed 8 Minutemen and wounded 10. They regrouped and continued on their way to Concord. They arrived in Concord, and by this time, the countryside was alerted. There was Minutemen gathering on the north side of Concord. They began to search for supplies. Captain Barrett of the Concord Minutemen was thought to have guns and gunpowder in his house, so they sent 7 companies to the north end of town to find Colonel Barrett's house. They crossed the North Bridge, and just to protect it, they left 3 companies there. 4 continued to the Barrett farm. The rest of the British searched the town. They found some limbers for cannons. They put them in the center of town, and they started to burn them. They had a bonfire going. Meanwhile, about 500 Minutemen were gathered on a hill on the other side of the North Bridge. They saw the fire in town. They thought the British were burning their homes, so they decided to advance and challenged the British holding the bridge and going to town. Active Minutemen led the way. Their commander, Isaac Davis, was a gunsmith. He had made sure all his men were competent shooters. They had target shooting. Because he was a gunsmith, they all had bayonets, so they were the best prepared unit of the Minute Company, so they led the advance. It was recorded that they marched to the tune of White Cockade as they advanced down. British fired a couple of warning shots. Finally, the British opened fire and shot right into the Minutemen. Isaac Davis was one of the first men killed. One other man was killed on a bridge. 2 British soldiers were killed. That's a painting of the North Bridge. The British are on the left side defending the towns in the back, and this is when they initially opened fire. So that was the first organized engagement with controlled fire on both sides. The British retreated into town, kind of gathered their stuff together. The Americans, they kind of stayed there. They weren't sure. I mean, they were shocked by what happened. It was a big surprise. The British eventually, around noontime, left Concord. They had to march all the way back to Boston. By this time, there was like 4,000 or 5,000 Minutemen gathering from all over to meet the British, and they received, it was a running battle all the way to Boston. When they arrived, the British had lost 73 killed, 200 wounded. The Americans lost 49 killed and 46 wounded. So it was a pretty bloody battle that ran the whole length from Concord to Boston. The British retreated into Boston. The siege began. It was surrounded by all these Minute companies. And that was the beginning of the siege of Boston. Also at this time, May 10th of 1775, unbeknownst even to the people of Massachusetts, there was a group of militia from Vermont, who wasn't Vermont at the time, I don't think, under Ethan Allen, and also another young, charismatic officer who came up from Connecticut insisting that he be in charge. So he shared the duties on the attack on Fort Ticonderoga, and that gentleman's name was Benedict Arnold. So Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen attacked Fort Ticonderoga. Really wasn't an attack. They just ran in and made the commander surrender. I don't think anybody even fired a shot. But it was valuable because they had 60, 70 cannons in Fort Ticonderoga, and I just read when I was doing this, they also had found 30,000 flints. So it was a kind of a warehouse up there. And just remember that, because that's going to come into play later on. May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met. Now that war had broken out, they had to get organized, they had to form an army, they had to pick a leader. They chose George Washington. He was charismatic. He had served during the French Indian War. He had experience. He would kind of unify the northern troops and the southern troops. So he became their commander on June 15th, the birth of the army. Before he could get up to Boston to take over the command, the Americans were doing something different. This is Boston, again, the north end of Boston, and this is Charlestown, right across the river. So there's the Charles River. And you see there's two high points on the Charleston Peninsula. Bunker Hill, way up here, is the highest point. Halfway down is a smaller hill, Breed's Hill. During the night of June 16th, the Americans came down and occupied Charlestown Peninsula, and they decided that they could put some guns and a force over there to be a lot closer to Boston, and they chose to fortify Breed's Hill. So all night long they dug a redoubt, dirt embankments to protect the men. And when the British woke up on the 17th, they saw Charlestown Heights occupied, and they had to take it. So they ferried an entire, about 2,000 men over to the shores of Charlestown. They began to attack Bunker Hill on June 17th. They thought it'd be a piece of cake, just these unorganized, untrained militia hiding behind a pile of dirt. So they brought the finest army in the world that attacked them, and they failed the first attack. They got beat back. They failed the second attack. And you see how they're fighting. This is linear tactics. They're organized shoulder to shoulder. The intent was to get close enough, about 30 yards away, to release a volley and then charge and take the breastworks by bayonet. So finally, in the third try, between sheer determination and the fact that the Americans were running out of ammunition, they took Bunker Hill. The British casualties was 1,000 killed and wounded. That was half the force, 50% casualties. The Americans lost 400 to 500 men. One of the casualties on the American side was a young commander. He was a doctor in Boston. He was a very high son of liberty named Joseph Warren. He was shot dead on Bunker Hill during the battle. And the towns of Warren and West Warren are named for Joseph Warren, who was killed at Bunker Hill. So in the fall of 1775, Boston was still under siege. The Americans surrounded it, but we didn't know how to occupy it, take it. And there was a young man who ran a bookstore in Boston named Henry Knox. He had read books about the military, about artillery, and Washington recognized his knowledge and made him part of his staff. And Henry Knox suggested, wait a minute, didn't we just capture Fort Ticonderoga up in New York, and don't they have a lot of cannons? So he proposed to go up to Fort Ticonderoga in New York, carry those cannons all the way down across Massachusetts to Boston in the winter of 75, 76. Washington gave him permission, so he went up there. He hired, bought, confiscated oxen and horses, built sleds, loaded 60 cannon onto these sleds, and began the trek in January and February to bring them down to Boston. This is a painting depicting the scene, roughly what it looked like, the effort they had to go through. There's the fort in the background they're leaving. But you look from that map, they had to go down across the mountains of Vermont, across the Hudson River, across the Connecticut River. They had a thaw that they wrote about that just caused a lot of problems. But eventually they made it to Boston. It was called a noble train of artillery, this process. And when they came across Massachusetts, it's Route 9. They came through Warren, Brookfield, Spencer, and you'll see these markers. There's one on the north end of the Brookfield Common. There's one in Spencer right in front of Price Chopper. It's a plaque that recognizes that, well, you can read it, through this place past General Henry Knox in the winter of 75, 76, to deliver George Washington at Cambridge, the train of artillery from Ticonderoga used to force the British Army to evacuate Boston. And they did. Well, they evacuated Boston on March 17th, 1776. It's recognized it's a town, city holiday. It all happens to be St. Patrick's Day, so they have a big parade. But it's really Evacuation Day. March 17th is celebrated every year in Boston. And the British, once they left, they never came back. That was the last time they were ever in Boston. In summer of 1776, of course, the committee met again. Remember, they were going to meet, and they wrote up the Declaration of Independence. It was passed and signed. So we are now an official country. We're still in the middle of a war, but we have an identity now. That summer, things didn't go well. The British attacked New York. The Americans lost New York City. They lost Brooklyn. They retreated across New Jersey. They went into an encampment in Pennsylvania. At the end of the year, December of 1776, most of the enlistments were going to expire. Washington was going to lose his army. They were demoralized. They had lost all of New York and New Jersey. And he came up with a plan. The British were in Philadelphia, nice and warm, eating well, enjoying the winter. He had 3 or 4 camps, or whatever you want to call it, along the perimeter, protecting them from the Americans. One was at Trenton, one was at Princeton. The one at Trenton was occupied mostly by German Hessians. They were hired troops from the German area of Europe that fought for the British, and they celebrated Christmas Day. So Washington had a plan. He crossed the Delaware River in the wintertime, which had never been done, marched down and attacked Trenton on the day after Christmas, figuring they'd be still sleeping. And that's exactly what he did. So he crossed the Delaware at night, in a snowstorm, I'm told, and he attacked the British at Trenton. It was a total victory. They captured 918 Hessian and British soldiers. The American casualties was 5. The General Rahl, who was the German commander of the Hessians, he was killed in that battle. And they found a note in his pocket the night before when he was celebrating Christmas Eve, or Christmas Day night. Somebody came in and handed him a note. It was an important message from one of the outside farmers, and he just put it in his pocket. And when they found it, after he died, they were removing his vest, and they took out the note that said, "The British are going to attack tonight," but he never read it. Who knows what might have happened. Washington came back January 3rd and attacked Princeton, had another victory. So all of a sudden, the Americans are looking good. Morale is up. That winter of 1777, they went to Morristown, New Jersey, and encamped there and spent the winter. The summer of 1777, oh, that's right, I got one. This is the type of cabin. They built winter cabins to spend the winter in. Pretty crude. I just can't imagine the suffering. They were shortage of food. They didn't have winter clothing. Blankets were scarce, but they spent the winter and survived. The summer of 1777 was quiet. But in the fall of that year, there was a British General, Johnny Burgoyne, and he had a plan. He was up in Canada, and he thought if he could march an army down the Hudson River and have St. Ledger, another British officer, come across New York, and Clinton come up from New York City, they completely cut off New England, and they thought that was a way that they could defeat the Americans piecemeal. So he came up with that plan and began with 7,700 men. He left Canada to come down. Unfortunately, Ledger got to Fort Stanwix. Americans came out and attacked him. He was defeated and he retreated. Clinton, for some reason, never came up. He instead turned around and went down to Philadelphia to do some, I don't know, reinforce people down there. So John Burgoyne was all by himself coming down, and he didn't travel lightly. A lot of his officers had wives and families with them. He had 3 or 4 wagons full of champagne. He had bands of music with kettle drums. He had a 50, 60 wagon train. They didn't move very fast, and they were being obstructed by the Americans. By the time he got down to Vermont here, he was running out of supplies. He heard they had supplies over in Bennington, Vermont. He sent a force of 500 men over there to get supplies, food for him. They were defeated by Minutemen who rallied in Vermont, and they lost that battle. He ended up meeting down in the Saratoga area, Freeman Farm, Bemis Farms. They fought 2 or 3 battles, and eventually he surrendered. 5,700 men surrendered at Saratoga, and this was a big deal. This was a huge British army being defeated by the Americans. France was looking for a reason to join the American cause, and he really didn't have anything up and run out. This is what they needed. So France came in as an ally on our side. They convinced Holland and Spain to donate money, supplies, muskets, uniforms. So things were beginning to look good for the Americans. And by the way, the army that surrendered at Saratoga, oh, I hit the wrong one. They were marched to Boston to be sent back to England. They came down almost the same route that Henry Knox did. So Route 9 through Spencer and Brookfield, the British Army of 3,000 or 4,000 men were marched through there as prisoners in the fall of '77. Okay, winter of '77, '78. That's the surrender at Saratoga. It was Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. Pretty bleak winter quarters. Again, no action took place in the winter. Both armies kind of settled down because it was hard to move, to transport, and of course to stay comfortable. One good thing that happened to the Americans at Valley Forge was a Prussian general came over from Europe, reported to General Washington and said, I offer you my services, you don't have to pay me, I'll help you train your army. So Baron von Steuben arrived in February of 1778, and he began to drill the soldiers. Washington said, do whatever you want. So this is a painting that shows a Prussian general kind of pointing, trying to get this ragtag army into shape, learning how to march, drill. And it was funny, he had to have an interpreter because he didn't speak English. So he'd yell out his command, and these guys would then turn around and say it in English, and they kind of go back and forth. And they learned a lot of Prussian cuss words, I'm told. But anyway, it worked out well. They learned how to fight European style. Washington wanted a European army to meet the British one-on-one in fields, stand up linear fighting, and this is what von Steuben did. In fact, his drill manual that he had printed, the U.S. Army used it for the next 30 years. It was that useful and that effective. Winter of '79-80, they went back to Morristown. It was the worst winter in 100 years. They suffered miserably again. It's a state park, and they have restored cabins in Morristown, New Jersey. If you're ever driving by there, you can see them. As a result of Saratoga, in 1780, in July, 5,000 French troops arrived in Rhode Island under Rochambeau. The British, by this time, had to change their strategies. They had been losing in the north, losing in New England, and they decided they moved south, capture the south. They had a little more allies possibly, and they moved their way up and captured New England coming from the south. So they moved south, Charleston, South Carolina. The British commander, General Cornwallis, was placed in charge. And the fighting in the south was very ugly. The civilian population, kind of half of them were loyalists, they wanted to stay with the king, and the other half were ready to join the American cause. So a lot of times in the fighting, it would be neighbors against neighbors almost. It was a very, very brutal fighting. So Cornwallis decided he was going to move north out of Charleston, South Carolina. He sent a force under British officer Ferguson and a loyalist force with him to the western part of the state to kind of protect Cornwallis' left flank, and also to keep the Americans in that part of the state from rising up. And he got pretty nasty. He made an announcement, he put it out that said anybody who joins the American forces, they'll be hung, their houses will be burned, and it wouldn't be good treatment. Well, these people in the western part of North Carolina and part of Tennessee, they were called Over the Mountain Men. They decided they were going to come back and give Ferguson a lesson. So on October 6th, at the Battle of Kings Mountain, South Carolina, Kings Mountain is a hilltop, heavily wooded. Ferguson was camped up there with an army of loyalists. These Over the Mountain men had rode over the mountains in the snow and attacked Ferguson. Very violent, bloody battle. The Americans won. This painting depicts Ferguson on horseback being shot. He was shot and killed. Total American victory. The British were defeated. In this battle of Kings Mountain, there was one British soldier in the entire battle, and that was Ferguson. Everybody else were Americans on either side. In January, shortly after that, There was another battle fought in South Carolina called, it's called the cow pens. And it was just an area where farmers used to bring the cattle, fence them in before they took them to market. It was called the cow pens. So Daniel Morgan, an old American veteran, he had been in Canada with Arnold in '75. He was at Saratoga, and he was in command of the American forces. And the British attacked him, and he wisely, strategically used the militia, the regulars, and the cavalry, and had a complete victory at the Battle of the Cowpens. The British lost 900 killed, wounded, or captured, and that represented 9/10 of their force. What you can see here is the result of von Steuben's training. These guys are lined up, very disciplined, 2 ranks. You can see the British coming at them, but they were meeting a one-on-one in military fashion of the day, and they were succeeded. They succeeded in this battle. So at this time, and one other gentleman who was operating in this area, kind of guerrilla fighting. He was stayed in the backcountry in the swamps of Georgia, Carolinas, but he would attack British supplies, capture British forces. His name was Francis Marion. And if you're a fan of Walt Disney like I am, you know him as a Swamp Fox. He was a real character, and he was operating in the South, kind of guerrilla warfare, attacking the British very successfully. So between all these defeats, Cornwallis decides he better get back to Virginia, to the coastline where he can get supplies and support from the British Navy. So he moves his forces back to Virginia and ends up in Yorktown in August of '81. He figured with the British ships there, he can get supplies and he can have support from the guns and get a little reprieve from these Americans. At the same time, this summer of '81, Washington and Rochambeau are coming down from the north. They're going to attack Cornwallis and Virginia. The French had a fleet down in the West Indies under de Grasse. They were notified. They sailed north. They met the English fleet right off in Chesapeake Bay under Admiral Graves, and they fought the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. And the British lost. They retreated, went back to New York. So the French now had control of Chesapeake Bay. This is the picture. Yeah, so this is what ended up. Cornwallis is in Yorktown. He's on the York River. He's got fortifications all around him. And he's surrounded by French and American forces. The French have control of the water. So he's got nowhere to go, nowhere to get supplies. At this time, the British, he had 6,000 men in Yorktown under Cornwallis. The Americans had 9,000 soldiers, and the French had 8,000, so he was heavily outnumbered. There was a number of battles, single engagements fought. Redoubt number 10, redoubt number 9 were taken. Again, his lines kept getting smaller and smaller. He eventually, on October 19th, 1781, surrendered. And it's interesting, when Cornwallis surrendered, he said he was too sick to come out to surrender his forces. So he sent his Deputy General O'Hara to the French army to surrender. And the French said, no, you surrender to Washington. So this second in command of the British went to Washington. Washington said, you're not going to surrender to me, you surrender to my second in command. So he sent General Benjamin Lincoln, the number 2 American, to accept the surrender from the number 2 British. So they surrendered at Yorktown, and that pretty much ended the conflict of the Revolution. They sent diplomats over to Paris to work on a peace treaty. They met in November of '82. January 20th of 1783, they came up with the Articles of Peace, and they signed. September 3rd, '83, the final treaty was signed. The American representatives, Ben Franklin, Henry Lawrence, John Adams, John Jay, and Thomas Jefferson, they agreed to pose for a painting with the British counterpart to commemorate this treaty. They showed up, but the British never did. So this is famous unfinished painting of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. There's the American representatives, and the British one was not there. So that's pretty much the end of the war. But it began with all these militia companies, mostly in New England. This is the Sturbridge militia on its training field, right across the street, the training field. And you can see again their costumes, their uniforms. There are no uniforms. They showed up in their civilian clothes. Later on, you can come up and see an example of a regimental uniform, a rifle shirt, just a loose linen frock. But that's what they did. They trained. It was an army. It was a volunteer army, and it led. And they went. We don't know. I think Wally's working on it. It's hard to trace Revolutionary War veterans because paperwork was scarce. A lot of them went off for 2-3 weeks and came back. Some joined the Continental Army. So it's a work in progress. But it all started out with just volunteers from the Sturbridge militia who they did respond when they got the word. If a contingent left and went. I know Timothy Parker, he was a captain of the militia company in Sturbridge. He, in one of the record books, he served, I think they said 23 days under Colonel Warner in Worcester. So he did go to Worcester. I think they said he left on the 20th or 21st. But anyway, it's very vague, but they did respond. They turned out, and whether they went to Worcester, to Boston, or all the way down to Yorktown, they won the war. I'd like to, before you leave, 2 things. One, I have a display of odds and ends, some weapons. In those things I listed, the militia had to have a knapsack, a hatchet, a knapsack. We have all those things up here. My friend Rob Lyons and I will do one more thing to give you a 4th dimension, I guess. We're going to play a tune on the fife and drum. The fife and drum was a very common instrument in the armies. It was an official instrument of the Army. Supposedly, a young man named Jonathan Harrington was a member of the Lexington militia. He showed up with his drum and beat the long roll that called the Minutemen to Lexington. That drum is on display at the Publick House, I think, in Lexington. And just to follow up in Yorktown, the Americans noticed one day a British soldier with a drum and a British officer with a white flag, and the drummer was playing parley. And that's what we started the negotiations and ended in Yorktown. So you might say the war began and ended with a drum. So bear with us, we're going to play 2 tunes for you. And then again, please come up and see our display. And let's play the tunes and then I'll take questions.
We were both at Yorktown, and then from Lexington, so we've been friends, and he's a wonderful friend and did a brilliant job. Very good job.
Dressed like a soldier from later in the war. He's got the full regimental coat, all the equivalents of a continental soldier, so that's different from the Minutemen. The first tune we're going to play is called the White Cockade. It's documented as having been played by the Minutemen when they marched down to contest the British force at the North Grecian Conference. It's one of the first tunes written down, recorded, that had been played during the Revolution. It's called the White Cockade. Yeah, good.
recreating their march from Rhode Island all the way down to Yorktown. So they recreated that, and the French troops were a great, great help. And I also have a French musket. Now, as great as that was, the French, it was an old gun that was no longer used by them, but they did give us a weapon. So I brought along an original Charleville French musket that was carried by many, many troops on the York side. So you're going to do
That's on Yankee Doodle.
now this tune, you'll see it's a little different than the one you know. This is the actually Revolutionary War Yankee Doodle.
That's a good question, and I don't know. Yes. The question was, do we have any records? There's a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers, when the war was over, they were might have been paid by their state or by the community with land grants or being given some land as opposed to, cash or something. And I don't know. I know that happened in some instances, but I don't know if that was if Sturbridge has any records. That's a good question. Ebenezer Kraft, the guy who had the cavalry troop, he owned this tavern at that time, so kind of connected right here in this building. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I thought you might relay the story of the writing of taps.
That came in later.
I believe that was.
Yeah. Okay.
That's another 2 years down the road.
Okay.
Pipe and drum was a very important part of the military, had been for years, and still is. It goes in the old guard. I mean, the pipe and drum wasn't just for marching. The drummers would play beats. It would get you up, tell you when to eat, when to go to war, when to go to battle. Everything a soldier did, the pipe and drum music was there to tell We didn't have bagpipes, which was a military instrument, but we had pipes and drums.
And you're all familiar with that. What's the first song you hear in the morning if you're in the Army? Reveille. So that was a tune, that was a song, and that dates back. There was a reveille written in the Revolutionary War, pre-Revolutionary War, through the Civil War. That was, think of the pipe and drum as being the communications, radio, the PA system. That's how you communicated sound over long distances before you had any electricity. So every company in the Revolutionary War, through the Civil War, every company had one pipe and one drummer, mostly for communication. And off duties, they might entertain as well, but it was a very important function of the armies to have pipers and drummers as
The
communication.
age was 16 to 40. Because there was a young drummer at Concord who beat the gathering. William Diamond. There's a drum corps, the William Diamond Drum Corps, which are young kids even today who form this group and play that music. William he was at Concord and he beat the assembly. Lexington.
Bugles serve the same purpose. Bugles serve the same purpose. In fact, they kind of took over later on because they carry much further, and especially the cavalry. You can't play a fife riding a horse. So you can stick that bugle up against your lips, and you can go in a gallop and play it. So yeah, bugle. But even in the Revolution, there was bugles being played. They kind of took over dominance. And World War I, World War II, bugle was still being played.
You mentioned at the Boston Massacre, John Adams defended the British soldier. Under British law, did due process, or have you?
Yeah, I think. You want to answer that?
Yes, it would have been under British law because we were still British.
Right.
So at that time, you're still members of the British, and so yes. And he was a lawyer, and that was his job. And again, you know, our image is that image that Paul Revere put out, and that, again, that was important propaganda. But when you read the various accounts of what happened that night, it was much less clear, again, who ordered who to fire, what was the provocation, and the issue was that provocation that they were defending themselves, that it wasn't that they were lined up. And you see that in various accounts. But it was very effective, what Paul Revere was able to do. So, you know, we think of propaganda being very modern. It's not.
One more comment about Paul Revere. I mean, he accomplished what he did that night. We would not know about him if it wasn't for a poem written in 1862, I think. During the Civil War, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote this long poem, kind of to get people patriotic and feeling good. And I guess this is my children. Right. No, listen to the claws and the famous ride of William Dawes. It just doesn't ring the same way. But it's because Paul Revere, later in the war, he led an expedition up. He was one of the officers in Penobscot, Maine. And he retreated before some reinforcements came, and he was court-martialed. So he really was not that well-known or that much of a hero until this poem came out. It really made him what he is today. Because again, William Dawes and even Samuel Prescott, they equally wrote, and there was other writers besides these three, because the word Bissell, there's a guy named Bissell who wrote all the way to Philadelphia with the news. So, but we know Paul Revere because of that poem, and we'll take that. It's all right. Yeah, go.
I mentioned Doug and I are Marine actors, and we've done Civil War and Revolutionary War, and I did 1812. But you know, as a reenactor, you get a small feeling of what it's like, but not the whole feeling. There's not bullets flying at us. You're not seeing your friends falling and dying. But it does give you enough of a respect for these people that went through that. And I had the honor of actually in 1975-76 being on the Knox Trail. And I was a group that was selected to do that. In Massachusetts, that was their big event. And they did it in January. It wasn't in July.
And I remember a few nights, I actually slept on the West Brookfield Common at 15 below zero, if you want to call it sleeping. But just to do that trip, we didn't go from Fort Ticonderoga, Massachusetts started on the border out in Egremont, but then came all the way to Cambridge. But just that feeling of what it was like, what it must have been like to do it back when there were no modern roads and oxen, it just gives you an appreciation for what these veterans had done and what they sacrificed to give us our freedom. And I think that's why we do it, is just to honor those people. And I mean people all the way up to present, what they do.
No, just say thank you. And if you have more questions, you can ask. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there? Oh, yes. Yep.
In 1771, John Adams had a feeling that he needed to get away from the farm for a little while. And he also had heard about the Stafford Springs, where you could take the waters and feel better. So he came out this way on a horse by himself, and he commented it was very boring with no one to talk to but himself. He stopped in South Warren for a meal at the Hodges Tavern, and he recorded this in his journal, so we know that he was there. This in South Warren was the crossroads of two important stagecoach routes, one from Boston to Springfield and another from Worcester to Stafford Springs. So that was one thing that made Warren in the record books, and another thing was Burgoyne's army of 10,000 men, they said. I can hardly imagine how many that must have been, how much room that took up. But anyway, they stayed overnight in Warren, says the record. So we are in the history books.
Thank you all for coming. Doug and Rob will answer questions. You stand, who is dressed up back here, and you can come and see the things, and we hope to see you May 22nd at 10 a.m. in the morning and in the evening here. Thank you.
That is a really neat part of the scrimshaw.
Yeah, it's a reproduction. It's got my name on it. A friend of mine out west, we were in the army together, he made it for me. But that was common, they would often have them engraved. I was told some of them was almost like a dog tag, because you didn't have a dog tag, but if I was killed, they picked this up and said, oh, this is Doug Quigley from Sturbridge, Massachusetts. And they know who it was. Oh yeah, and they become right. Right. Again, not everyone was trained, but many were. You see in museums and collections, they usually say the best one. It was not uncommon. There are many that have, John Smith, his stories, question, I would say by World War II, standard, but I don't know. It was considered a fighting weapon because this was Yes. Something. And they're still active, they're stationed at Fort Myer, they've served in all the wars, yeah. But they do all the ceremonies. Right. You see the Arlington. Yeah, similar to that. Yep. Doing the other soldier, that's the company of the old guard, the caisson with the cannon, the burials, the funerals, that's all the old guard. They have different companies that do all that stuff.
Good job, Douglas.
All right, not bad for my first time.
Good, I saw you had my picture up here.
Yeah, you were in there.
That was one of them.
Is that okay?
Thank you very much.